this person's going to be probably really badly hurt.
But somehow he isn't.
You can tell he's under the influence of something, whether drink or drugs.
The car thief doesn't have any obvious injuries at all.
Criminals have this irritating ability of escaping any harm for what they do. I quite often liken them to cockroaches.
It was the kind of crime that doesn't make sense at first glance. 2 people shot to death inside their own home, young children sleeping just rooms away, no signs of forced entry, no random chaos, and the man now accused of pulling the trigger, a highly trained vascular surgeon. In the early hours of December 30th, a quiet neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio became the center of a crime that would shock investigators and leave an entire community asking the same question. How could this happen? And who was capable of planning it so precisely? What initially appeared to be a double homicide? It was the kind of crime that doesn't make sense at first glance. 2 people shot to death inside their own home, young children sleeping just rooms away, no signs of forced entry, no random chaos, and the man now accused of pulling the trigger, a highly trained vascular surgeon. In the early hours of December 30th, a quiet neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio became the center of a crime that would shock investigators and leave an entire community asking the same question. How could this happen? And who was capable of planning it so precisely? What initially appeared to be a double homicide quickly revealed layers of calculation. The suspect, police say, did not act impulsively. According to prosecutors, he traveled across state lines, entered a home without forcing his way in, and carried out the killings with a firearm possibly equipped with a suppressor. If true, this was not rage, it was preparation. As new indictments emerged, so did unsettling details suggesting this crime may have been planned long before the night the shots were fired. Digital trails, surveillance footage, a vehicle moving under cover of darkness, and a past relationship that refused to stay buried. The man at the center of it all once shared a life with one of the victims. Years later, investigators say that connection may have turned deadly. This case is not just about murder. It is about obsession, control, and how a carefully constructed public life can conceal something far darker beneath the surface. Because when the truth began to emerge, it raised a terrifying possibility. What if the person accused of saving lives believed he could also take them and get away with it? At the center of this case is a man whose professional life was built around precision, control, and saving lives. A vascular surgeon, someone trusted with the most delicate operations involving arteries and veins, now stands accused of carrying out one of the most calculated double homicides the city of Columbus, Ohio has seen in years. When news first broke, authorities were careful with their words. 2 adults had been found dead inside a home. The investigation was active. Few details were released. But as days passed, what emerged was not a random act of violence, nor a crime of opportunity. It was something far more deliberate. The accused had once been married to one of the victims. That connection immediately shifted the focus of the investigation. Years earlier, the couple had appeared, at least on paper, to part ways without conflict. Their marriage lasted only 2 years before ending in divorce. Court filings describe the separation as based on incompatibility. No children, no drawn-out legal battles, nothing that would suggest lingering hostility. After the divorce, their lives diverged completely. She moved on, remarried, and built a new family. Her new husband was a dentist, deeply involved in his work, and described by colleagues as reliable and devoted. Together, they had 2 very young children. Friends and family saw them as stable, focused on raising their kids and building a future. The accused, meanwhile, continued climbing professionally. He completed his residency, pursued advanced training, and worked across multiple states. On the surface, his life reflected success, prestigious positions, medical licenses, and a career that demanded discipline and intelligence. To those around him, there was little reason to suspect anything was wrong, but investigators would later uncover signs that his life was far less stable than it appeared. In the months leading up to the murders, he had reportedly faced professional issues. There were legal disputes tied to his work, questions about his whereabouts, expired licenses in some states, employers who allegedly did not know where he was at certain points in time. Then came December 30th. The first alarm did not come from a neighbor or a passerby. It came from work. When the male victim failed to show up for his dental practice that morning and could not be reached, concern grew quickly. He was known for being punctual, reliable, the kind of person who did not simply disappear without explanation. A call was made requesting a welfare check. When officers eventually entered the home, what they found confirmed everyone's worst fears. Both adults were dead, located on the second floor of the house. Each had suffered multiple gunshot wounds. Their children were alive, unharmed, and inside the home at the time of the killings. There were no signs of forced entry. That detail would haunt the investigation from the very beginning. If no one broke in, how did the killer get inside? And why leave the children untouched? As police began reconstructing the timeline, evidence pointed toward the early morning hours. Surveillance footage from the area showed a figure dressed in dark clothing moving through an alley near the home during that window. The individual appeared to avoid cameras deliberately. Shortly after, a vehicle was seen leaving the area. That vehicle would later become a critical piece of the case. Investigators traced it back across state lines. Records showed the car was registered to the accused. Data suggested it had traveled from Illinois to Ohio and then returned shortly after the estimated time of the murders. The theory forming was no longer speculative. Police now believed this was a targeted attack. Their confidence grew stronger when they searched the accused's residence. Inside, they found multiple firearms. Among them was one weapon that authorities say bears a preliminary connection to the crime scene. Shell casings recovered from the victim's home matched the caliber of that firearm. But what truly escalated the case came later, when a grand jury reviewed the evidence. The indictment did not just accuse the suspect of murder, it alleged aggravated murder, 4 counts, and aggravated burglary. According to the charging documents, prosecutors believe the accused entered the home unlawfully, while armed and killed both victims with a firearm equipped with a suppressor. If proven, that detail alone suggests extensive planning. A suppressor is not a common household item. It is not something used in a moment of rage. It exists to reduce noise, to avoid detection, to give the shooter time. Time is exactly what the accused appears to have had. Authorities have not yet publicly explained how the suspect entered the home without force. That question remains unanswered. What is clear, however, is that investigators believe this was not spontaneous. They believe it was intentional. After his arrest in Illinois, the accused waived extradition. He is now awaiting transfer back to Ohio, where he will face the charges. Prosecutors have not yet announced whether they will seek the death penalty, but under Ohio law, aggravated murder with multiple victims and alleged premeditation makes it a legal possibility. As the case moves forward, one reality is already impossible to ignore. This was not the act of a stranger, one that ended 2 lives and permanently altered the future of the children left behind. And this was only the beginning of what investigators would uncover. Once investigators moved past the shock of the discovery, the case quickly took on a different tone. This was no longer treated as a tragic mystery. It was approached as a methodical crime that demanded careful reconstruction. From the outset, detectives were struck by what the scene did not show. Violent home invasions, chaos usually leaves fingerprints everywhere. Here, the house appeared disturbingly controlled. That control immediately suggested familiarity, either with the victims, the home, or both. Both victims were found on the 2nd floor, each suffering multiple gunshot wounds. The location alone told investigators something important. The killer had moved confidently through the house. He knew where he was going. He did not hesitate. And he was able to do all of this while 2 small children slept inside the same home. That detail weighed heavily on investigators. Children are unpredictable. They cry. They wake up. They move. Any unplanned disturbance could have ruined the crime. Yet nothing did. Which raised the question, was the killer relying on luck or on planning? The possibility of a suppressor changed everything. According to the grand jury indictment, prosecutors now believe the firearm used in the killings was equipped with a silencer. If true, this would explain how 2 gunshots could be fired without alerting neighbors or waking the children. A suppressor is not a weapon of impulse. It requires intent, preparation, forethought. Investigators began mapping the accused's movements in the days and hours before the murders. Financial records, travel data, license plate readers, and surveillance footage painted a troubling picture. The accused appeared to have traveled from Illinois to Ohio shortly before the killings and returned not long after. This was not a coincidence. Police also reviewed surveillance footage from near the victim's home. In it, they observed a person dressed in dark clothing walking in an alley behind the house during the critical time window. The individual appeared to avoid direct camera exposure, turning away at key moments. That behavior, detectives said, was consistent with someone trying not to be identified. The vehicle seen leaving the area shortly afterward was traced back to the accused. The timing aligned, the direction of travel aligned. Combined with the lack of forced entry, investigators became increasingly confident that this was a targeted attack carried out by someone with both motive and access, which brought the investigation back to the past. The accused and one of the victims had been divorced for years. On the surface, there was nothing unusual about that separation. But as detectives dug deeper, they learned that the accused may have struggled with the fact that his former spouse had moved on so completely. She had remarried, built a family, established a new life that no longer included him. Investigators are often cautious when discussing motive, but they have stated publicly that they believe this was an act of domestic violence, despite the divorce having occurred years earlier. That classification reflects a belief that emotional ties and resentment may have persisted long after the legal relationship ended. At the same time, investigators uncovered signs of instability in the accused's professional life: lawsuits, expired medical licenses in some states, periods where even employers reportedly did not know his whereabouts. This raised another concern. Had he been living a double life? Someone capable of operating in high-pressure surgical environments would also understand anatomy, lethality, and precision. Detectives do not speculate publicly, but they acknowledge that his medical background could not be ignored when evaluating how the crime was carried out. When police searched his residence, they found multiple firearms. One weapon, they say, shows a preliminary forensic link to the crime scene. The aggravated burglary charge added another layer. To support that charge, prosecutors must show that the accused unlawfully entered the home while armed and with the intent to commit a violent offense. The absence of forced entry suggests either access or the ability to enter without raising suspicion. That unanswered question remains one of the most troubling aspects of the case. Did he have a key? Did someone let him in? Or did he exploit a vulnerability investigators have yet to disclose? As the indictment became public, legal experts noted that charging 4 counts of aggravated murder rather than 2, may indicate prosecutors are pursuing multiple theories of culpability for each victim. This approach allows them flexibility as the case moves toward trial. What is clear is this: prosecutors are framing the killings as premeditated, deliberate, and calculated. The accused remains in custody, awaiting transfer back to Ohio. Once extradited, he will formally face the charges, and the legal process will begin in earnest. For now, investigators are holding back key details, but the direction of the case is unmistakable. This was not random, this was not sudden, and according to prosecutors, it was not avoidable. Ending in a night that destroyed one family and forever altered another. It became clear that this case would not hinge on a single piece of evidence. Instead, it would be built slowly, layer by layer, through data, patterns, and behavior. Investigators understood early on that if this crime had been planned, the planning would leave traces. No matter how careful someone is, modern life produces records. Phones log movement, cars record travel, cameras watch silently, and people, especially those under stress, leave behind behavioral clues they may not even recognize themselves. One of the most important aspects of the investigation centered on timing. Authorities reconstructed the window in which the murders occurred, narrowing it to the early morning hours of December 30th. This time frame became the backbone of the case. Everything else, travel data, surveillance footage, phone activity, was analyzed against it. Surveillance cameras near the victim's home proved critical. While no camera captured the killings themselves, footage from nearby locations showed a figure moving through the area during the estimated time of death. The person wore dark clothing and appeared to move deliberately, not randomly. At several points, the individual turned away from cameras or walked in shadows. Behavior investigators interpreted as conscious avoidance. That alone was suspicious. But what made the footage far more significant was what followed. Shortly after the figure was seen, a vehicle was recorded leaving the area. Traffic cameras and license plate readers tracked that vehicle's movement away from the neighborhood. When detectives ran the registration, the name attached to the vehicle matched the accused. From that moment on, the case accelerated. Investigators expanded their analysis to include cell phone data. While exact details have not yet been released publicly, authorities have indicated that location data supported the theory that the accused traveled from Illinois to Ohio shortly before the murders and returned shortly afterward. In cases involving interstate travel, intent becomes harder to ignore. This was not someone who happened to be nearby. This was someone who allegedly crossed state lines, entered a specific home, and then left without being seen. Another focus of the investigation was the accused's behavior in the period leading up to the killings. Colleagues and associates were interviewed. Investigators examined work schedules, employment records, and communications. What they found suggested a growing pattern of instability. There were reports that he had become difficult to locate. At times, even his professional contacts were unsure of where he was staying. That raised alarms. People do not simply vanish from structured professional environments without explanation. Licensing issues, employment gaps, and unresolved legal matters painted a picture of someone under increasing pressure. Although the divorce had occurred years earlier, detectives noted that emotional separation does not always follow legal separation. They examined whether there had been continued contact, unresolved disputes, or lingering resentment. Publicly, police have not detailed the full scope of what they uncovered in this area. However, they have stated that they believe the crime was targeted and motivated by domestic factors, despite the time that had passed since the marriage ended. That conclusion did not come lightly. Investigators are typically cautious about labeling a case as domestic violence when years have elapsed. In this instance, they were confident enough to do so, suggesting they had evidence pointing toward fixation rather than coincidence. The search of the accused's residence further strengthened the case. Multiple firearms were recovered. While lawful ownership is not a crime, one weapon in particular drew attention. Forensic analysts believe it may be connected to the crime scene. Ballistics testing is ongoing, but early results were compelling enough to be included in the grand jury presentation. The mention of a suppressor in the indictment marked another turning point. Prosecutors do not include such language casually. That belief likely stems from a combination of forensic evidence, acoustic analysis, and the absence of reports from neighbors who might otherwise have heard gunfire. The presence of children in the home made that detail even more significant. Even so, they can make the difference between a gunshot waking an entire household and one that goes unnoticed. As detectives compiled their findings, they prepared their case for a grand jury. Unlike a trial, grand jury proceedings are one-sided. Prosecutors present evidence, witnesses testify, the defense does not cross-examine. The goal is not to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, but to establish probable cause. In this case, the grand jury returned a sweeping indictment. Legal analysts noted that charging 4 counts for 2 victims suggests prosecutors are pursuing multiple theories for each killing. This strategy allows flexibility at trial and increases the likelihood of a conviction, even if certain elements are challenged. The burglary charge carries its own weight. To sustain it, prosecutors must show unlawful entry combined with intent to commit violence. Given the lack of forced entry, this charge implies that investigators believe the accused entered the home without permission, possibly exploiting familiarity or trust. That unanswered question remains central to the case. How did he get inside? Authorities have been careful not to disclose that detail, suggesting it may be one of the most damaging pieces of evidence they hold. With the indictment secured, the case entered a new phase. The accused waived extradition and now awaits transfer back to Ohio. Once there, pretrial motions, evidentiary hearings, and possibly years of legal proceedings will follow. But for investigators, the most important milestone has already been reached. They believe they have identified the right suspect. They believe they understand how the crime unfolded, and they believe the evidence will withstand scrutiny. What remains is to see whether a jury will agree. And as the case moves toward that inevitable moment, one truth grows harder to escape. This was not a crime of chance. It was a crime that, according to prosecutors, unfolded exactly as planned. With the indictment filed and the accused awaiting transfer back to Ohio, the case moved into its most decisive phase, the legal battle that will determine guilt, intent, and punishment. The charges alone signal how seriously prosecutors are treating this case. Aggravated murder is Ohio's highest homicide charge, reserved for killings involving prior calculation, multiple victims, or additional felonies. Here, prosecutors allege all of those elements. 4 counts of aggravated murder suggest the state is advancing multiple legal theories for each victim, ensuring the case does not rest on a single narrative. The aggravated burglary charge further strengthens their position. It implies that the accused unlawfully entered the home while armed and with the intent to commit violence. Combined with the absence of forced entry, this charge suggests investigators believe the accused exploited familiarity or access rather than brute force. Together, these allegations form a clear prosecutorial theory. This was not a spontaneous act. It was a planned, targeted killing. But in court, allegations are not enough. The defense will focus on introducing reasonable doubt. One likely strategy will be challenging identity, questioning whether surveillance footage, vehicle tracking, and travel data definitively place the accused inside the home at the time of the murders. Even strong circumstantial evidence must withstand scrutiny when presented to a jury. Another key battleground will be intent. Aggravated murder requires proof of prior calculation. The defense may argue that even if the accused was present, prosecutors cannot prove the level of planning required by law. Forensic evidence will also face intense examination. Ballistics, firearm recovery, and the allegation that a suppressor was used are central to the prosecution's case. If prosecutors can prove a suppressor was involved, it would explain how multiple gunshots failed to alert children or neighbors and strongly support premeditation. The defense, however, will seek to undermine that conclusion. Motive remains another contested issue. Prosecutors have characterized the killings as a form of domestic violence, despite the marriage ending years earlier. That classification implies lingering obsession or unresolved resentment. The defense is likely to argue that too much time had passed for such a motive to be credible. Legally, motive is not required for conviction. In the background, a larger question looms: punishment. Ohio law allows the death penalty for aggravated murder under certain conditions. Prosecutors have not yet said whether they will seek it, but the presence of multiple victims, alleged premeditation, and the involvement of children in the home all make it a legal possibility. As pretrial motions and hearings approach, the case is shifting from investigation to confrontation. Evidence will be challenged, narratives will be tested, and every detail, travel records, surveillance footage, firearms, timelines, will be placed under a microscope. What remains undisputed is the cost. 2 children lost both parents in one night, one to death, the other to incarceration. Whatever verdict is ultimately reached, this case has already left damage no courtroom can undo. As this case moves toward trial, one reality stands above all others. No legal outcome can restore what was lost. Indictments, hearings, and verdicts may determine guilt or innocence, but they cannot undo the damage inflicted in a single night. For investigators, the indictment marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Years of analysis, surveillance footage, travel records, forensic evidence, and witness interviews have now been distilled into formal charges.